Hello, my name is Rebecca Chung, and I'm the director of 21 CSLA State Center. And welcome to our research practice webinar entitled Equity Now, Lessons for School Leaders for Centering Our Most Vulnerable Students. 21 CSLA is a project of the California Department of Education, the California Collaborative for Educational Excellence, and the State Board of Education. We're dedicated to the professional learning and support of California's educational leaders at the teacher, site, and district levels. Our goal is to create more equitable learning environments that ultimately improve success for underserved students. Our work is guided by an equity statement that reads, Leaders for Equity transform education to improve access, opportunity, and inclusion for students and adults, especially those who are systemically marginalized and historically underserved, so that they can thrive. Before we begin our webinar today, we would like to acknowledge our sponsors as well as the land in which our university, the University of California at Berkeley, occupies. We also want to acknowledge the land that is occupied by the University of California at Los Angeles. Specifically, we acknowledge that our webinars are taking virtually on unceded territory of the Muwekma Ohlone people at Berkeley and the Tongva peoples at UCLA. We recognize and honor the continuous presence and living history of Indigenous peoples. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the Leadership Board Chair of 21 CSLA, Dr. Jabari Mahiri, who will serve as the facilitator of today's webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our 16th webinar for 21 CSLA. I'm also given the pleasure of introducing our host, our guest for today, Dr. Tyrone Howard. He is the Pritzker Family Endowed Chair in the School of Education and Information Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Howard is the co-director of the UCLA Pritzker Center for Strengthening Children and Families. He's also the co-director of UCLA Center for Transformation of Schools. Dr. Howard has published over 100 scholarly journal articles, book chapters, policy briefs, and technical reports, and he's the author of, get this, 6 books. The most recent of his books is actually the focus for our conversation today, and we will talk a little bit more about that. It's called Equity Leadership Now, Justice, Repair, and Belonging in Schools. Dr. Howard is the president and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, which is the world's largest educational research organization. I kind of rushed through that a little bit. I want to emphasize Dr. Howard is the president of the world's largest research organization. In 2021, Dr. Howard was elected as a member of the National Academy of Education. His work has been highlighted in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post, among other media. For example, he's regularly featured on the National Public Radio and many other media outlets. Dr. Howard is considered one of the nation's foremost thinkers and change agents on issues tied to racial inequality in education. We want to say welcome, Dr. Howard, to our 21 CSLA 16th webinar, focused on something that's very close to the title of your book, Equity with Regard to Centering Our Most Vulnerable Students.
Thank you, Dr. Mahiri. It's good to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you for having me.
Well, welcome. And your most recent book, as I mentioned, titled Equity Now, Justice, Repair, and Belonging in Schools, is very close to the title of our podcast, which is Equity Leadership Now. So we definitely anticipate an insightful discussion about equity as it's reflected or applied to our most vulnerable students. But we want to focus this conversation around the challenges and opportunities for equity as they are faced by students in our schools who are not just vulnerable, that's problematic enough, but also specifically those who are unhoused or foster youth. So I'd like to begin by exploring these challenges and opportunities with regard to each of the terms in the subtitle of your book, Justice, Repair, and Belonging. What are key challenges and opportunities in schools for justice for unhoused and foster students?
Yeah, no, thank you for, again, the opportunity, Jabari. And I think that this conversation today really is anchored in what's coming up in 2 days from now. May 17th, 2024 will mark the 70th year anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education ruling in this country, which ruled separate but unequal education was unconstitutional. And yet today, here we are 70 years later, we still have a variety of subgroups who continue to face separate and unequal schools. So let me connect this to what it means for justice, repair, as well as belonging for unhoused and for foster youth. And part of what I lift up in my new book is that we cannot really say we're concerned about equity until we begin to focus on those who are most marginalized. And I think when you talk about foster and unhoused, they're two of the largest or most vulnerable populations. Let's start off first with those who are unhoused. According to the National Center National Center for Homelessness, there are approximately 1.5 million young people that we know of that are unhoused in these United States. Here in California, where we are, and many of our listeners are, we lead the nation, of course. We have close to 270,000 young people that are unhoused on any given night, which to me is deeply, deeply troubling because we know what the outcomes are for those individuals who are unhoused. So what does justice look like for those unhoused young people? It means to recognize them, to see them, to understand when they show up at schools, they are oftentimes not just experiencing housing insecurities, they're also facing food insecurities. They're also in many cases facing different challenges at home where there might be unmet needs in terms of employment, mental health supports for the adults who are caring for them. So schools need to be mindful of what that means. We have federal legislation, McKinney-Vento, that's designated to support young people who are unhoused. But yet when I talk to schools across this country, many practitioners and surprisingly many leaders don't know who their homeless liaisons are, don't know what jobs homeless liaisons have to do, or the homeless liaison is just a title attached to someone who deals with 3 or 4 or 5 other things. So justice would begin to look like having designated homeless liaisons who deal specifically with those who are unhoused, making sure they have proper supports, vouchers, food supports, that we begin to kind of destigmatize what it means for families and young people to be unhoused, call families in, say that schools want to help and support. Justice also means doing the right thing to ensure that we have school social workers who are on site. Those social workers can provide the appropriate services that those young people and their families might need. And you notice I keep saying, and their families, because that's a big part of this. And so part of what we have to recognize that I talk about justice, but I also talk about what it means to be in repair mode and to acknowledge the harm that's been done. And those young people who are unhoused, it's not because their parents don't care about their education or not working hard. In fact, I would say that frequently the folks who are the poorest typically do the hardest work in this country. And we know that about 60% of young people who are unhoused have working parents. So we have to begin to understand the structural inequality that has put many young people and their families in a situation where they're struggling with housing insecurities. A state like ours in California, where housing is becoming so unaffordable, is also a part of the problem. So we have to begin to look at policy and legislation that makes more affordable housing more applicable, and also find employment that pays people a living wage. So we can't just put this on schools to fix this. This is a much broader issue that we have to face. And oh, by the way, we see this through line that exists between many young people who are unhoused and those young people who end up in the foster care. And let me just talk about foster youth for one quick second, because in this country, we have a little under 400,000 young people who are in foster care. Dorothy Roberts says we shouldn't call it a foster care system. She says we should call it a family policing system because of the ways in which it disproportionately harms Black and brown children. Here in California, we have about 60,000 young people who are in foster care. And so what does justice look like for them? I think we need federal legislation, just like we do for those who are unhoused, for those who are in foster youth, that target specific interventions, specific supports, and specific wraparound services for those young people who are in foster care so that they can also begin to have better opportunities to learn and thrive and grow. We know that only about 50% of foster youth graduate from high school, less than 3% graduate from college. So we've got to be intentional that if we're going to do equity, and this is where school leaders have to be mindful and intentional and be unapologetically bold, to say we have to put a focus and a spotlight and resources on those two populations among others, because they also cut across other categories as well. Special needs, students who are most likely to be suspended and pushed out or expelled. So the intersectionality tells us that these young people face some deeply, deeply difficult challenges.
Thank you, Professor Howard. And how are the challenges for foster youth and unhoused youth actually accentuated more around issues of justice and repair and belonging with the ending of the McKinney-Vento funding that was providing, significant resources for a while to help address some of these critical needs?
Sure. So we know, number one, that McKinney-Vento is supposed to provide ongoing supports and services for those youth who are unhoused. But we know that oftentimes the districts don't always allocate those funds accordingly. We know we had a lot of COVID dollars that were used to help support those efforts, but those dollars are drying up, coupled with declining enrollment, added on to the fact that we have chronic absenteeism issue that's been a huge challenge, and a looming budget deficit in the state of California. We're going to see those supports become more scarce for those who are unhoused and for those who are in foster care. So I think what we're going to see is that our most vulnerable populations are going to face even more challenges as there will be fewer resources available to support them. So this is why we have to double down whatever supports that are in place now, psychiatric social workers, mental health therapists, counselors. Those are oftentimes among the first positions to go when you face budget cuts. So in this moment, I think what justice means is that we protect them. If anything, we try to add to those numbers. We begin to make sure that we have individuals who go out and knock on doors and find out what we can do to get young people into schools. We can't help them learn if they're not there. Justice also means that we're not engaging in the blame game of these young people and their families. But justice means understanding structural factors that have led to a disproportionate number of Black and brown families, because there's a way we have to racialize this as well to begin to understand who is harmed the most when it comes to those who are unhoused and those who are in foster care. And if I could for 1 second, Jabari, when we talk about our foster youth, one of the populations I'm concerned about are our transition age youth, those who are in the ages between 18 to 21. Because in many ways, once they begin to transition out of schools, the supports provided to them through social service agencies and through child protective services are oftentimes ripped away. So what justice would look like for those young people is ensuring that we think about legislation that extends their benefits up until age 25. We also have to begin to look at that a disproportionate number of TAY are members of the LGBTQ plus community. They're more likely to end up incarcerated, more likely to end up unhoused, and more likely to be subjected to a host of different negative ills that occur because we don't take more prevention-oriented steps. So justice would mean getting out in front of this on the front end and not seeing a bad problem become worse.
Justice is clearly the term that frames all of our considerations for repair and belonging also, but could you just talk for a moment about the issue of belonging specifically with respect to foster and unhoused youth? How do we create conditions, opportunities, circumvent the challenges for inclusion and belonging for these youth?
Yeah, I think first and
Particularly in the
foremost,
school place.
yeah, I think schools have to start off first by making it okay to talk about your family circumstances if you're unhoused or if you're in foster care. So let's take the unhoused population first. And Earl Edwards has written about this extensively. He talks about the fact that we need to think about what justice can look like for the unhoused in schools from a leadership standpoint. Is we have to do a better job of getting an accurate count of who are the families who are unhoused. I was at a school last year, and I remember a principal walking me to the back fence of his school in out by the courtyard. He showed me about 10 to 15 cars that were all lined up by the lights. He said, all those young people are unhoused. They live in cars with their parents. And so what he says that, but the school has strict rules on not allowing some parts of our buildings to be accessible to those who are unhoused to at least use the essentials such as showers and toilets and things of that nature. So I think we have to recognize that we have to get an accurate count for those who are unhoused. Then B, we have to see what is it that we can do to make sure that their basic needs that are being met, such as food, medical supports and things of that nature. Students can't learn when they don't know where they're going to sleep at night. Students can't learn when they don't know if they're going to be in a shelter that night. And so I think what schools have to do is make sure that they're flexible with grading requirements. Schools have to make sure that they're flexible with testing mechanisms because, again, we know that the absenteeism rates for those who are unhoused is among the highest in our schools. We have to figure out why young people are in this situation in the first place. If that means extending our after school hours at schools, because sometimes the only safe place for the unhoused youth might be in our schools. So sometimes I see schools having 3 p.m. to 7 p.m. after school supports. And even some schools, I saw a school recently in Delaware that had a Saturday school so that young people it could be at school even on Saturday. Sometimes school is the only place that provides shelter, the only place that provides 2 meals out the day. So we have to think in a very different way for those youth who are unhoused to make sure basic needs are met before we can think about their academic needs. And then for those who are in foster care, the bottom line is we have to make sure from a school standpoint that justice means that we are constantly in touch with school social workers, with social workers who are the caseload managers for young people, making sure we're all on the same page. We have individual, education plans for students who might might have special needs. How about if we had, special needs, a plan, IEP type format for those who are in foster care? These young people are oftentimes moved from placement to placement to placement, which means school to school to school. We have a young lady we worked with at UCLA for years and said she had a total of 28 different placements from the time she started kindergarten until the time she graduated from high school. And that is not her fault, not her family's fault, but what schools need to do is have greater lines of communication across districts, across counties, across jurisdictions, so that these students don't have their assessments lost in the process. So schools just need to be mindful of who their population are, and we're seeing surges in the number of youth who are unhoused and those who are in foster care, and we cannot stigmatize them. We have to support them.
I want to make a tiny shift to another aspect of your book, and we're going to be using this book in our leadership programs beginning in the summer. And I'll tell you why in terms of this question. You begin chapter 4 by stating it's difficult to create equitable schools without strong, culturally responsive, and equity-focused leadership. You further describe how site leaders typically have strengths in one or more of 5 categories: instructional leader, building manager, visionary or inspirer, a data miner, or the fiscal expert. So what are specific ways that school leaders need to leverage or further build on these specific capacities to more effectively address the needs of all of their students, but with a particular focus on unhoused and foster students and their families?
Sure. And so I came up with those categories based off of spending a lot of hours in schools, talking to school leaders, observing school leaders, as well as talking to different the teachers who work with these leaders. And I think what it comes down to, I want to be greedy. I want us to see leaders who have all those assets, that they're instructional leaders, that they're building managers, that they're inspirers and visionaries, that they're data managers. All those things is what we want in leaders. And when it comes to those who are unhoused and those who are foster, let's take one example of the instructional leader. What we know is the following, is that young people who are unhoused or the young people who are experiencing time in foster care, there's a higher likelihood that those students are behind academically. So what does that school leader need to do from an instructional standpoint to support those students? Number one, I think that, and let's take the elementary level, ensuring that the students who have the greatest academic needs are oftentimes placed in classroom with teachers who are the strongest instructionally. That's important. What we see in schools today is oftentimes the students who have the most academic needs are placed with the teacher who has the least experience. That to me is not justice. Or if you don't have those teachers who have strong instructional skills and strategies, how about that instructional leader begins to model, provide coaching, provides supports to those young people, to those teachers who might be just developing the kind of instructional repertoire that they need to ensure that those students who are unhoused and those students from foster care get the kind of supports that they need instructionally, right? That doesn't mean remediation. You can have rigor, depth, and complexity to your instruction while you're still helping those students who are trying to catch up. But I think it means modeling what scaffolding looks like, how to differentiate instruction, how to think about sort of, the ways in which you do think, pair, share, so students can work in small groups, how students can get one-on-one tutoring. I think that there are things that leaders can do from an instructional standpoint that can begin to really address some of these issues that we see within the context of the vulnerable population we're talking about. And let me give one more example.
Okay.
I talk about data miners because I see a lot of leaders who live by their data, which I think is great, because you cannot move unless you understand the lay of the land you're dealing with. So what does your data tell you about trends that you see amongst your youth who are unhoused or those who are in foster care? What we know is that those schools that best support those two groups, they are able to tap into community-based organizations. They're able to tap into community-based resources. They asset map in a way that says that they know that if schools cannot do it by themselves, there's evidence-based practices with the YMCA down the street. There's evidence-based practice with the Boys and Girls Club that supports these young people. So the data miner has to have asset mapping steeped in evidence-based practices that lets him, her, or them know there are supports and resources right within my own zip code that I should be using at my school on a regular basis.
So since you're dealing so effectively with what leaders need to know and be able to do, I want to draw our attention to a quote that you made in terms of this fact that you say, not everyone is in the same place along their equity journey. And you
Mhm.
mentioned this in the introduction. So how do school leaders, he, her, or they, deal with these, differential spaces that the people that are stakeholders in their organizations occupy, while we're all trying to move toward the same goal of equity and justice for all of our students, with a particular emphasis on those who are most vulnerable?
Yeah, let me just be a straight shooter right now with you, Jabari, because I think one of the biggest issues, and I say this a lot, and I know I upset some of my teacher friends when I say this, but I'm gonna just be as honest and as transparent as I can be. I oftentimes tell my principal leaders that your biggest challenge in your building are not your students. I'll say it again. Your biggest challenge in your building is not your students. What do I mean by that? The biggest challenge I maintain for many school leaders are the other adults in the building.
Mm,
And I say that with a clear sense of recognizing that so much of this work is rooted in mindsets. Uh, what principals and school leaders have to do is look at adults and ask them, what do they fundamentally believe about people who are poor, young people who are poor? What do they fundamentally believe about Black and brown children who might not come from nuclear homes? What do they think about young people who might be immigrants, or they might be in families that are led by folks who are immigrants? And what do they fundamentally believe about those who are unhoused and those who are in foster care? Because if you don't have the right mindset, everything else we can try to talk about falls on deaf ears. So therefore, you have to start with mindsets of trying to make sure people who are doing this work have the right mindset where they understand how structures and systems affect people more than values and choices. And once we start there, then we begin to recognize that everybody's at a different place on their equity journey. What does that mean? There are folks who have understood and thought about these issues around structural racism, structural inequality for decades, and have a much better and much more keen sense of how these factors have an impact on people's ability to be humanized. So you can begin to have much more complex and in-depth ways of having discussions with those folks compared to someone who for the first time has just developed a consciousness and an awareness around how systems and structures are more important than what we think about values and choices. And so I think what we have to do in this point is not push out folks who are not far enough along their equity journey if they're school leaders, but we have to pull them in and say, look, let us begin to help you understand that this is not about sympathy for those young people who are unhoused. This is not about sympathy for those who are in foster care, because sympathy doesn't help anybody. Telling the kid who's unhoused, I'm sorry, does not change his condition, doesn't make that child less hungry. Telling the child, I apologize for the fact that you're in foster care, does not connect that child with his or her or their family. What helps is in a consciousness and an awareness that these young people have shown uncanny resilience to still show up at school despite factors around them. And the best thing, the most important thing that we can do as leaders is to ensure that for the 6 hours or the 8 hours they're in our buildings, they get access to high quality teachers, they have a safe environment, they have supportive peers around them, and they have all the tools around them that can help them to be successful. So therefore, being at different points of the equity journey, we have to be sensitive to how we bring adults along because we need them in this work.
Now, there's a couple more questions, and one of them picks up exactly on what you were saying about our most difficult challenges are with the adults in the building, and we need tools to deal with those adults. At the School of Education here at Berkeley and our leadership programs, we often do a lot of work with our emerging leaders on hard conversations, and you go deeply into that arena. And so I want to ask you a question that's based on the introductory chapter where you state many people are conflict averse and they do not want to have hard conversations about why students fail in their schools every year. Our willingness to play safe and play nice is making us complicit in student failure. So how do educational leaders create structures and spaces for all school stakeholders to engage in the kinds of hard conversations that can uncover and set conditions for solving difficult and often culturally conflicting problems generally, and specifically in relationship to the way unhoused and foster youth get marginalized?
Yeah, yeah. Again, so I'm going to engage in a brave space conversation now, Jabbar, because I think first and foremost, I say this all the time, leaders have to be bold, leaders have to be courageous, and many of the leaders that you all work with, you know this. If you're doing this for popularity reasons, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. You are not going to be the most popular person if you're going to lead these conversations. I tell leaders that your job is not to be well liked. The leader is to be well respected as a leader. And that means that you're going to have to make decisions that are not going to make everyone happy. You have to have a thick skin if you're going to be a leader, because people will take shots at you all the time. They'll criticize your decisions. They'll second guess your choices. They'll question your competency. They'll raise issues around your preparation. And so you can't let that bother you, because when you see issues, and this is what I talk about in the book, I think for leaders who are going to be willing to have brave space conversations, you're going to have to raise the questions that no one else wants to raise. You're going to have to do the things that folks don't want to have done. This is the work of leadership. And I maintain we have adults in schools, and many folks can tell you, who do harm to children every single day. And the adults who do this harm oftentimes never get approached by their leaders about why they can't do better. And I think that, to me, is criminal. So I would say that what leaders have to do is say, listen, we need more from you. And let me outline what more we need from you. And if you can't provide more, let me know how I can support you to give you more. And if my support is not sufficient and you can't give us more, then maybe you have to question if this is the right place for you to continue doing this work, because you're doing, in some cases, irreparable harm by not showing up for other people's children. And that's the conversation that leaders have to have. And I know lots of leaders who shy away from those conversations because they don't want to be deemed as being unsupportive, or they don't want to be disliked. This is not the work for making friends if you're going to be a leader. If you want to be a leader of schools in this era, you're going to have to be willing to have very hard, very uncomfortable conversations about adults who do harm to children. And sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes the level of apathy that some folks have, they don't think about the harm that's being caused to young people. But when you bring it to their attention, then they have a duty and responsibility to do something different. So this is where I ask leaders to lean into this. And if you're not courageous enough, and you're not bold enough, perhaps leadership in schools may not be the work that you want to do at this moment.
Amazing. We have two leaders who are going to be brought into this discussion in just a second, but I have to ask you this question since you were talking about how we need to be bold, because you raised it in your book. In chapter 3, you talked about we have to address even things like the N-word as significant hate speech. And you argue that no student should use the N-word at school ever.
Yep.
I agree with you, but how do we go about mitigating this feature of contemporary youth speech that is so pervasive in the African-American vernacular? And we're going to have a short response to that.
This is a good one. I was in a school yesterday about this, and I understand the whole issue around the N-word and folks saying that Black folks are trying to reclaim that word and the use of ER versus A. I get and understand all that, the usage of the N-word in hip hop vernacular. I get all that. But part of what we have to recognize that the word has gotten out to the point where everybody uses it now. And folks who are not Black use it. And they use it in ways that are upsetting and offensive to lots of Black children and Black adults. So therefore, I make the very unpopular stance to say that it should not be used at all in schools by Black children, by non-Black children, by anybody. Now, how do we begin to police that? I think we have certain norms and rules. We don't allow hate speech in schools at all. If we have a student who says something anti-Semitic, we tell them that's not appropriate. If we hear a student that says something that's Islamophobic, we shut that down. That's not appropriate. If we hear misogynistic language, we say that's not acceptable. We don't allow it. Same thing with the N-word. If we see it as a form of hate speech, it cannot be used. It will not be tolerated. And adults have to enforce that across the board. It can't be one teacher here, another teacher across the hallway. Everybody has to be on board to make sure that we are creating the kind of spaces that are free of hate speech and any form of language that is considered offensive to folks who are in those groups.
Well, you got me on board, Professor Howard. I want to introduce our two practitioners, both of whom are superintendents in California schools. We have Luis Valentino. Luis is a seasoned educational leader with vast experience in K-12 and higher education. He's been a bilingual classroom teacher, program coordinator, and site district administrator, and as superintendent of the Coachella Valley Unified School District, and previously as chief academic officer of the Portland Public Schools. He has created and dedicated his career to advancing equity and facilitating transformational change. Tyler Graff is currently the executive director of the secondary education in San Rafael City Schools. His current role involves him in overseeing middle and high school curriculum and instruction and creating systems that support unhoused students and foster youth within the school district. And next year, he will join the Ross Valley School District as the superintendent. So he is completing his doctorate here at UC Berkeley in our first cohort of the Leaders for Equity and Democracy Educational Doctorate Program. Welcome to superintendents. who are going to also weigh in on these considerations that we've been addressing with Dr. Howard. And we're going to offer the same question to you, and I'd like for you, Luis, Dr. Valentino, to start off. And it's the essential question of what are these key challenges and opportunities in schools for justice repair and experiencing belonging for unhoused and vulnerable students?
Thank you, Dr. Mahiri, thank you, everyone. Pleasure to be here. In listening to Dr. Howard and thinking about how we address the historical marginalization of most of our vulnerable students, realize that it requires immediate action. And Dr. Howard's clarion call to dismantle systemic barriers reflects our district's mission and the mission of many districts in this country. However, the challenge in creating those brave spaces for the honest dialogue that is requires a great deal of courage. And he points to leadership today. And at this point in time, leadership takes an incredible amount of courage. In some contexts, you are going against an incredibly politicized and racialized headwind. And in others, you're dealing with individuals that have an opposing or laissez-faire attitude towards addressing the needs of our students. And so those brave spaces that Dr. Howard talks about really are required because you're going to have to address it at the highest levels of the school districts, from the school board members to the cabinet members, and so that it can eventually permeate across the system. One of the things that we tend to do in K-12 is we blame the teachers, and we expect the teachers to fix the problem. And if not the teacher, then the principal to fix the problem. When the fact of the matter is, it's all of our responsibility. And just like Dr. Howard added, it's not just K-12's responsibility, it's also the community's responsibility and the partners who have to be a part of the solution. And so for me as the superintendent, it's really about how do we create those spaces where those conversations take place alongside sets of actions that it actually begin to address some of those things, right? During COVID, it became worse. The oppression that was created as a result meant that when we came back from that, marginalization worsened. And so that gap needed to be addressed. So just creating health centers at the middle school and high school level and elementary schools, some of them. Expanding the counseling services that are there for not only the students, but the staff and the parents as needed. Both serve as examples of how one has to respond to the question that Dr. Howard is asking, but more importantly, it has to become visible across the entire organization, saying that no matter what the role is that I play in the system, I contribute to bringing equity to the table and addressing the inequities that presently exist in our system. And I think if we begin to do that well, comprehensively and in a sustainable way, we will begin to move further along in centering instruction around the inequities that exist that keep students from being successful.
Thank you so much. And I want to turn the same question over to Tyler Graff. And before I move in that direction with your response, you will be walking and being hooded in our first cohort of lead doctoral students on Friday. So I'm going to be the first one to call you Dr. Graff. Give you 2 days of preliminary getting used to that term, which I know you won't have a problem with, but you're also in charge of supporting unhoused students and foster youth within your school district. So with the same question of exploring these challenges and opportunities with regard to justice, repair, and belonging, what are the considerations on the ground in your arena that you guys are working with around these challenging issues?
Well, I think it goes without saying that, given the fact that California is such a diverse state, that the challenges are going to be different depending on what county you live in and what district you work in. For Santa Fe City Schools, our number one challenge that we're facing is the number of newcomer students that we have. A lot of them are unaccompanied minors that are 11th and 12th graders that are coming to our schools. And we have a largely white teaching staff that serves 60% Latino students. So that racial literacy and increasing the mental models, improving the mental models of our teachers really is, just like Dr. Howard highlighted, one of the biggest challenges that we have. We have a really wonderful group of teachers in our Bridge program that serve our newcomer students in 11th and 12th grade. Those people are excited. They see the resilience that these students have demonstrated, and understand how eager students are to learn the English language and graduate high school. But that's not true for all of the teachers in our school district. So it's really important to increase racial literacy amongst our white teachers. I think that's critically important. The other thing that Dr. Howard actually says in his book is that mental health matters. And I think that is something that Dr. Valentino just highlighted as well. We have wellness centers at both of our high schools and have increased our counseling services, particularly for our newcomer students. So they get more one-on-one counseling that can help them with legal documentation, access to food, access to housing. And most of our unaccompanied minors are actually doubled up in apartments. So they're technically, by McKinney-Vento standards, classified as homeless. So making sure that they have, housing is really important. And then I think one thing that I see too often is that educational leaders tend to be, like myself, really interested in the teaching and learning piece. I was a classroom teacher, was a principal. Instructional leadership is the thing that really gets me fired up. But if you're not a fiscal expert and you don't know how to leverage title dollars and connect with grants to serve these students, there's not enough funding that's coming from the state to give the students what they need to be successful. So I think that fiscal expert piece is something that's really, really important when designing structures to support unhoused students.
Thank you. We have a couple minutes before we go to our questions from our audience, our participants, and just like to see, Dr. Howard, if there's any reflections that you have on what our two, equity-oriented practitioners have shared.
No, I think they're both spot on. I thank you both for lifting it up. I think the issue around what Superintendent Valentino talked about, wellness centers, is vital, and I see more schools that have wellness centers across the state of California. My concern becomes the staffing of those wellness centers as we look at looming budget cuts, right? Because there's evidence that these wellness centers have helped the social emotional well-being of students, to help with issues of anxiety and depression that we know many young people are facing. So I appreciate you lifting up the importance of those wellness centers. And the future Dr. Graff, I thought he was spot on when he talked about those dollars, because now we know that leaders are going to have to be very resourceful in how they leverage dollars, how they stretch their dollars, how they're more efficient with their dollars. This is going to be the sort of the new normal for the next couple of years, because as we see these cuts that are forthcoming, I'm concerned that some of the problems that arose as a result of the pandemic, we know have not gone away, but yet the supports are evaporating, and yet we're going to expect school leaders and school practitioners to respond, and we're like tying their hands behind their backs if we don't find better ways to support them.
What a team we have here of practitioners, scholars, people who are committed to doing this work. We want to open it up to our participants in this webinar. We have almost 100 participants who are joining us today in this discussion, and they're going to we've curated a few of the questions that seem to reflect key considerations that are coming from our participants. And I'd like to read the first one, and you can just, whoever wants to jump in to begin addressing that question, just go ahead and take the lead. So unhoused students can face a lack of social capital in schools. They are often stigmatized and unseen. Where are there examples of schools and leaders who challenge those stigmas and reframe negative stereotypes related to unhoused students?
Well, interestingly enough, I'm in a school district that actually underreports Latino community, 100% free and reduced lunch. And so there is this tendency of unhoused students to move in with an aunt, a cousin, a neighbor, a friend. And so the services then become limited available for them because there is an underreporting. The stigma, and it's not because of the stigma, but because it's part of their experience. That's what you do when you're unhoused. The challenge for us is to call that out and be able to identify and name that for them so that they can then access the services that are needed. Whereas in Portland or San Francisco, where I worked, there was a stigma attached to that. So they did not want to report, which meant that those visiting the home, our home visitors, made it a point to speak to the families and share with them the benefit of reporting it, and that there really isn't a stigma to it. Of course, when you're 15 years old, it doesn't look that way.
The only thing that I would add to what Dr. Valentino said is the importance of relationships. Adults need to spend time getting to know the students that are in their classrooms. It's absolutely important if you're going to create a space that has that's focused on belonging. So whether a student's a newly arrived student to the country or a student who's experiencing homelessness, understanding that student, getting to know them as a person outside of, what they do in the classroom. And then once you build that relationship, you can start connecting them to the resources that are in the school district or in the community. And I think that so often in my setting, the cultural difference between teachers and students is such a gap that there's a misunderstanding, and teachers need to bridge that gap by having cultural humility and getting to know their students so they can connect them to resources and just have empathy and care for them. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and if I can add one piece, I think both doctors are spot on. And if I can add to Dr. Graf's point, trust is critical in this piece as well, because relationship building cannot happen if there is no trust there. Many young people may want to confide in their teachers or their principals about what they're experiencing around being unhoused. But if the concern is, if I tell you that we're living in our car, and you then in turn turn around and call Child Protective Services, then that has a set of bad outcomes. I'm not going to do that if I don't trust you. And this is the through line and the connection between those youth who are unhoused and those who are in foster care. Many practitioners operate from the standpoint, and leaders too, that look, neglect is the #1 reason why young people are in foster care. Some parents think, some practitioners and some leaders think that if a family is unhoused, that must be general neglect. There is no evidence to support that. This is where in this country we criminalize poverty. And so, but if there's trust that's in place, that student can come to that teacher, and instead of calling CPS, that teacher or that school leader may help that student and his or her, their family, find resources and supports, to Dr. Graf's point, and not think I've got to call in the authorities to take you away from your parents because you're experiencing homelessness.
I think what you all are hitting on is the way we have to transform mindsets in order to do this work effectively and successfully. And I think people in our audience are reading your book already, Dr. Howard, because one of them wrote into their question a quote from your book, which says, if you don't have the right mindset, everything else falls on deaf ears. And their question was, if you were to distill the right mindsets for serving the unhoused, what would they be? Are they specific beliefs about the unhoused that would help adults reorient and move toward really approaching equitable care of our unhoused students better? Let's explore this notion of how do we get to those right mindsets? And I don't know, Dr. Graf, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I think this one, this was part of my doctoral research, is shifting teacher leader beliefs about equity within the school schedule. So I think this one is really important. Teachers have these mental models that have been built, school leaders do as well, I do every day, about who our students are that show up. And I think it's important to create counter narratives to that mental model that we might have about an unhoused student or a newly arrived student, and understand the resilience and brilliance of these students, because there's a lot that they bring to the table that every other student in the classroom can learn from. And it's about finding what that brilliance is and uplifting that, and sharing that you believe in those students. So it kind of goes back to the trust and the relationship building. But I think that that's something that needs to continue to happen.
I'm going to steal your line, resilience and brilliance. I like the alliteration that's going on there. Luis, what can you contribute to this mindset issue?
Well, the challenge there is how do we do this at scale, right?
Mm.
In every school district, you will always find that teacher. You will always find that principal that actually sits at the nexus of more enlightened leadership. But the challenge is doing that at scale, where not even government policies or practices support the systems in being more mindful and more thoughtful, and expect that their own role is not just the academics, but the building of communities that are safe, both physically and emotionally safe for students to be who they are, for them to feel that they're being cared for, that their social emotional wellness, that their mental health is being taken care of and addressed within the school system. I know there's an expectation that schools address all of the ills that exist in society. It's not possible. However, where it is possible, it's really about targeting those efforts, making sure that we allocate resources accordingly so that those things that we believe to be true in addressing the needs of students, that we are able to keep them in a sustainable way at the highest level possible.
Yeah, they've
Howard.
said it. Yeah, I don't know what more I can. I think they're spot on. I think, one of the things I've frequently said is that when I say we, I mean, I'm in teacher education. We have to think long and hard about who we let into this profession. I think we have to move away from this idea that the schools, once they have teachers, will bring them up to speed. Just because a young person has a high GPA doesn't mean that they're equipped to teach. Just because a young person spent a summer abroad in another country doesn't mean that they're equipped to teach. We have to be more mindful about who we even allow in this profession in the first place. And then the second safeguard is we have to ask leaders to think long and hard about who are the people that you're about to hire. It requires a real brave space conversation of looking individuals in the eye and asking, what do you think about poor children? What do you think about kids whose first language is not English? What do you think about Black children? What do you think about, and don't give me just the buzzwords. I love all kids. I think all kids can learn. You have to see the real, I love Dr. Graff's point, the resilience and the brilliance that these young people bring every single day. So the mindset shift means you see these young people as learners. You see their ability to be thinkers. You don't just see these deficits. You see that these young people are problem solvers in all that they do because their lives are full of solving problems. That's a skill set. That's a strength. That's giftedness. That's talent that we can tap into to say if that young person at the age of 10 has the responsibility of picking up 2 or 3 younger siblings from school every day, getting on a bus, taking them home where there's not an adult there because the adult is working, but yet making sure that that young person, that same young person helps those younger siblings get their homework done, helps them get fed, helps them take baths, all the things that many adults do every single day. And we don't see that student as gifted and talented, then shame on us because those young people demonstrate gifts and talents every single day. We just don't have the right color lenses on to see that. And all we see is they're homeless and we feel sorry.
You led right into a final question because there were many questions, but this is the last one we have time for. This person was particularly interested in unofficial foster students. The person said that they, like myself as a child, may live with different family members by the week, by the month, or even by the year. So how can leaders leverage supports for students who are not officially recorded as foster or unhoused or unaccompanied minors, etc.? Just jump in whenever you're ready. We don't have to go in any order.
Now, I'll just say this. There are some cultural considerations that we need to be mindful of. I grew up in a household where we always had cousins, aunts, uncles live with us. Many families have that cultural dynamic, and that's just normal. We don't see folks as unhoused. We don't see folks as in foster. It's just the cultural literacy that we need to have more leaders to have to be mindful of. However, I will add this, and there's a growing body of research that talks about being doubled and tripled up, that causes a whole host of challenges for families and for the young people that we need to be mindful of. Comes back to what Dr. Graff talked about earlier. Relationships matter. And if leaders and practitioners have those relationships with families and students, they would understand how to best support them. Even though they haven't been reported, there still can be some challenges that are there and some resources that we need to help find for those families.
Thank you. Luis?
Thank you, Dr. Howard. as I process through, one of the things that, as I shared earlier, that is very common is the doubling and tripling of environments, of homes, with families. And it makes it really difficult. It makes it really difficult both for them as a family, but for us as a school district in being able to allocate the necessary resources accordingly and be able to target the supports that are needed for those families. Being able to see and be able to parcel out, to discern, becomes a critical aspect. And Dr. Graff talked earlier about as classroom teachers, the kind of culture and climate that we establish in the classroom really is critical to supporting students from those homes in the school. Without the teacher being able to see and then name it, it becomes really difficult to respond to it. And so for us as a school district, it's really important to work with our staffs, from teachers to site administrators to district office administrators, to work together to identify the best strategies to really work towards that kind of targeting and creating that kind of visibility that actually will help those families.
Mm.
And I think, you know, I'm lucky enough to work in a school district of about 7,000 students. So it's relatively small. So I can walk down and talk to the CBO and leverage money in a way that might be different if I was working in Oakland Unified or San Francisco Unified, where budgets are a little bit more metered out and allocated. So I think one thing that I see from our site leaders and folks here at the district office is creative thinking. When a student or a group of students need support, we have to write language to make sure it fits Title I or Title III or, you know, McKinney-Vento funding. And I think that's incumbent on us to be creative about that, or partner with a community-based organization that we know can offer a service that a family might need, even if they're not technically designated as unhoused. There's other ways we can get resources to folks, and it just takes a little bit of creative thinking and a little bit of care. And I think if you can approach it with those two factors, you can get most students what they need, but you have to have the will to do it.
Gentlemen, we're closing in on the end of our conversation here. This has been phenomenal. This webinar is going to be put online, and I know people will be using it in a number of different ways. But in closing, we want to get a comment from each of you, and I want to pose this situation. You find yourself on an elevator going up to the 29th floor with the governor, and he's the only other person on the elevator with you, and he finds out what you do, and he says, well, I'm thinking about applying a lot more resources to this very issue. Can you give me a quick insight on what would be the best way to apply these available resources to this issue of unhoused and foster youth? And I want to start with the practitioners first. So since Tyler just spoke, I'm putting you on the spot a little bit, Luis, but the elevator door just closed.
So I think the resources really should be allocated for partnership. Certainly in my community, it is the kind of school district that, because of its 1,200 square capacity, the limited health services, the limited social services, it really does require that we partner as a school district with services that actually can help us both in addressing mental health and wellness, housing, nutrition. All of those things have to be part of, Dr. Howard called them the wraparound services that many school districts use. And now the legislation has community schools grants, of which we are one of the recipients, that when we create integrated school communities, we are then better able to partner together to identify how best to use the resources in addressing the needs of our students who are unhoused, who are foster youth, et cetera, because alone, neither the district can do it, and neither can the community partners do it.
We just got to the 29th floor. The door opened, and Tyler steps on, and the governor says, "Oh, I forgot to get my coffee mug down on the first floor. What do you do, Tyler?" And you tell him, and he says, "Well, what would be the best way to apply this significant funding that I'm getting ready to address for unhoused and foster youth?"
I'd pull Luis right back into the elevator and say that same thing over again. I agree with what Dr. Valentino is saying. I think all of those things are critically important. The wraparound services, particularly in San Rafael, where we have newly arrived students who are unaccompanied minors, access to lawyers to help them become documented citizens. I think that's super important. I think housing insecurity is an issue for those students. Food insecurity is an issue for those students. So all of those wraparound services are really important. Also connecting them with jobs. Almost every single one of our students works after school, and building out CTE programs are really important too. You can have a CTE program that actually parlays a student into a high paying job that can give them a living wage after they graduate high school. So I think that's important. And I think there needs to be more communities of practice around serving newcomer students. We are on what I would say is kind of a bleeding edge of supporting our newcomer students. And as we look around the Bay Area, there are very, very few resources for us to look or model after to serve our newcomer students. So I think that's what we would need in San Rafael.
Professor Howard will let you close us out. You don't have to stay within the scenario, but whatever you want to share with
Oh,
us
I
in
love
this
the
last
scenario.
minute.
So I pulled Dr. Valentino and Dr. Graff back into the elevator. I would try to simplify. I would ask the governor if he would look at some of the data on the results of basic income, universal basic income for families. A mere $1,000 extra a month would go a long way to helping those who are unhoused because they could then afford housing. That same basic income of $1,000 a month would also help families who fall into the child welfare system because they get taken away from their families because of neglect. Children should not be taken away from their families because families don't have enough food. Children should not be taken away from their families because they don't have enough housing. Children should not be taken away from families because they don't have enough clothing. $1,000 a month, the data has shown families spend for their most basic needs, and it keeps families out of poverty. It keeps families out of homelessness. It keeps children out of foster care. So I would really say basic income goes a long way, and we now have evidence to support this. That would have a tremendous impact on our families. As Dr. Valentino said, schools cannot do it alone. We need our elected officials to put more dollars in the pockets of our working families. It would make a big impact.
Dr. Tyrone Howard, Dr. Luis Valentino, Dr. Tyler Graff, I want to thank you so much. And also thank you to our participants. Almost 100 people showed up for this important seminar. You raised amazing questions. Thank you so much. And we'll see you at webinar 17.